Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board games from Z-Man Games. A few months ago I did my top 10 favorite board game publishers, and Z-Man did make it to that list. I'm not going to spoil as to where it ranked on that top 10, but they are one of my favorite board game publishers, and they are known for having a very vast catalog with lots of variety as far as their different board games are concerned. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 10 board game published by Z-Man Games, and that is Pandemic Rapid Response. And this here is one of the few Pandemic products out there that's not actually designed or co-designed by Matt Leacock, the original Pandemic designer. Not only that, this is one of the few Pandemic games that, other than its theme, isn't really Pandemic. The mechanisms are not like Pandemic really at all. What's taking place is players are on an airplane, and basically the board consists of all these different rooms on that plane. And you're also going to have a plane miniature that's going to be placed on this track to go around representing the different countries or cities that they're trying to go to in a very abstract way. And there's much fewer cities represented here than in typical Pandemic. But the plane is moving clockwise or counterclockwise, trying to advance as far as possible to get to particular cities and deliver particular resources, deliver particular supplies. And each of these rooms corresponds with different actions. Some of them correspond with the particular supplies that you're trying to get, whether it be water or medicine or food or some type of energy source. And basically, throughout the course of the game, players are going to be rolling their dice here, and they're going to be rolling these dice, and depending on the symbols that they roll, they're going to be placing them on these slots on these rooms that they're in and triggering different actions. Mainly what they're trying to accomplish is to unlock supplies in order to deliver it to these locations. Lots of really cool things going on, but the neatest thing about this game that really makes it stand out from Pandemic is that this is a real-time game. I forgot to point out that this is by Kane Klenko, who is known for Fuse and other games that are known for their real-time element. In this game here, you're going to have this sand timer, and every time it's flipped over, you're going to remove a time token from the board. And these time tokens, they're these purple little tokens here. These time tokens are basically your end game trigger. So once these time tokens are all removed from the board, because this timer has been flipped over a certain amount of times, players have run out of time. Now, there is a little bit of way of mitigating the real-time element to this game, which isn't always the case in real-time games. You could actually buy yourself more time, because every time you successfully accomplish one of your missions, that is, you deliver supplies to a particular city that came out in your objectives, every time you accomplish that, you get to place another time token on the board, which buys you a few more minutes. Really cool cooperative game, just like the Pandemic games. Gives you that thematic sense of urgency and feel, heightened by the real-time element. Really cool. My number 10 Z-Man game, Pandemic Rapid Response. Now we move on to my number 9 board game for Z-Man Games, and that is Carcassonne, the classic. And I am a fan of Carcassonne. I've been playing Carcassonne now for almost 10 years. And this game has been out for over 20. And this is a gateway style game, but I do play with expansions. I always include the Inns and Cathedrals and Traders and Builders expansions. And sometimes I add a few of the other expansions to really add variety to the game. Now, my favorite iterations of Carcassonne are no longer vanilla Carcassonne. I like Castle, Carcassonne the Castle. I like Carcassonne City. I even like the Hunters and Gatherers. And none of these have ever been published through Z-Man Games, but Z-Man still holds the rights to the base game here. And I am a big fan of it for what it means to me historically, the impact it's had, and how easy it is for me to teach this to non-gamers, to children even. Fun game, classic tile lane, my number 9 board game from Z-Man Publishers, and that's Carcassonne. Now we move on to my number 8 game from Z-Man Games, and that is Le Havre Inland Port. And this game here is a game that very few people talk about. First of all, I must admit that Le Havre, the base game, the original Le Havre from Uwe Rosenberg, is one of my favorite games of all time. And although I do think that Le Havre might have at one point been with Z-Man Games, or might be with Z-Man Games now. The edition that I own is for Lookout Games, not from Z-Man. So I'm only counting them based on what's printed on my actual boxes here. And Le Havre in L'Import is going to take this spot here because this is a two-player only iteration of Le Havre. And Uwe Rosenberg does this quite often, where he takes his big, massive, grandiose worker placement style games, and then he condenses them, he confines them to smaller, shorter, two-player only experiences. We have Caverna, Cave versus Cave, and Agricola, all creatures big and small. However, I find that those games are very similar to their originals, while Le Havre in L'Import is very different from Le Havre, which is one of the reasons why I think it hasn't been successful. I think people buy this game or bought this game looking and expecting to experience Le Havre Light. But that's not the case. This game is very different. Thematically, you're still trying to accomplish the same thing. You're trying to produce resources, convert resources, use your money in order to buy buildings, and have the most wealth at the end of the game. It still has the concept of an uneven amount of actions per round, because that's really the thing about Le Havre. Every round, you're going to have a collective pool of actions for all the players, but it's an odd number, which means every round, one player or multiple players are going to have more actions than some of the others. And it's the same idea here. You got 12 rounds, and each round, one player is going to have one more action than the others. The cool thing about this game is that the actions actually rev up. Early on in the game, the first few rounds, you only have 3 collective actions, but by the end of the game, you're going to have 9 collective actions. So a lot of different things that can take place. And basically, you're manipulating these grids here, which represent your warehouses. Really makes for a very strong spatial element to this game, because you're not simply just adding tokens that represent your resources. You got to find a way to efficiently manipulate this grid in order to get the most bang for your buck as far as your resources are concerned. Really cool. I like this game. Again, the Le Havre feel and the fact that it plays so different mechanically speaking. My number 8 board game from Z-Man Games, Le Havre in L'Import. Now we move on to my number 7 game from Z-Man Games, and that is Pandemic the Cure. And this one here is a co-design by Matt Leacock. Actually, it's a solo design by Matt Leacock. And this game here is the dice iteration, the dice reimplementation of Pandemic. And I have this here on the list, a spoiler, separate from Pandemic, because it is a very different game, mechanically speaking. First of all, it's strictly dice-based. There are cards, but you don't actually do card play. The cards just represent the events that you can purchase in order to trigger their actions. And everything consists of these dice here. And every individual character, every specialist from the CDC is going to have their own set of customized dice. And they're going to have a unique configuration of the 6 faces of the die according to their player character. As a matter of fact, they're also going to have some symbols on their dice that none of the other specialists have on their dice, which really makes them unique to contribute in a different way than all the other players towards the goal of curing these viruses and treating these diseases. Really cool. I find that the dice element definitely makes it a much more swingy, unpredictable experience than Pandemic. So you can be radically annihilated and lose very quickly, or you can get a little bit of luck of the roll and perhaps win a game that feels a little bit easy. But that's never happened with me. Every time I play this game, it's excruciatingly difficult. More times than not, I lose. But I really do like the element of the dice rolling. I like the element of the different characters and how they contribute. Really like this game. My number 7 game from Z-Man Games, Pandemic the Cure. Now we move on to my number 6 board game from Z-Man Games, and that is Pandemic. And the entire Pandemic line of games I'm counting for this spot right here. I'm counting Pandemic Legacy. I'm counting Pandemic Iberia, Pandemic Reign of Cthulhu. All of these iterations of Pandemic, which are some of my favorite versions of Pandemic. But basically, essentially, the games, mechanically speaking, play different enough or similar enough that I'm going to count them into one spot. Unlike Pandemic the Cure and Pandemic Rapid Response, which play radically different. Now, this game here, the classic game about, again, curing and treating these diseases. There's 4 different viruses in the base game. You can add additional viruses if you purchase expansions. It adds a 5th purple-colored virus that's even more challenging. Lots of really cool things going on in this game. It has been a trailblazer in the industry. It's been an innovator and a pioneer. Yes, there were some cooperative games before pandemic, but pandemic really is what made this genre of cooperative games catch fire and really made a lot of people start thinking, a lot of designers start thinking about how they can capitalize on the popularity of that genre as well. My number 6 board game from Z-Man Publishers, Pandemic. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 favorite board games from this publisher, from Z-Man Games, starting with my number 5, which is Arle and Labora, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. I mentioned the big, grandiose Uwe Rosenberg worker placement games, and this is certainly one of them. I find this to be the heaviest and longest of all the Uwe Rosenberg games I've played. Definitely the longest. The shortened version of this game can easily take 2 hours, and the long version of the game can push 3. So that's a really long game. And basically in this game, the gimmick of this game is this wheel right here, which is spinning to indicate the value of all the different resources. And there are tons of resources in this game. The only game I could think of that rivals this game in resources is Le Havre. It's very similar to Le Havre, where the resources are represented by these squared tokens that are double-sided, and one side represents an upgraded version of the other, which is, again, very similar to Le Havre, because lots of what's going on in Le Havre is also happening here, where not only are you acquiring resources, not only are you converting them and exchanging them for different resources, but quite often you're taking actions that are going to upgrade your resources into a more valuable version of itself, a more refined version of itself. And what's taking place in this game is you're kind of doing a little bit of city building. This game depicts monastic medieval life, and you start with your little cloister office here, and you're going to be building buildings represented by cards. You got these cards here that represent your different buildings, and each of these cards are not only going to give you additional worker placement spots for you to trigger actions in the future, but they're also going to give you victory points. And there's a huge spatial element to this game, because throughout the course of the game, not only are players taking on actions and paying money in order to add additional plots of land to their original starting board, but the order, the orientation in which you place your building cards and the cards that are adjacent to them all matter. As a matter of fact, the different terrain types on which you place your buildings even matters. There's restrictions as far as that goes. Really cool. I like everything that this game has to offer. The only thing that kind of hurts it on my list, and why it probably doesn't rank higher than number 5, even though 5 is pretty high, is the fact that it is very long. It's hard to get to the table. It takes a while to set the game up, and it's kind of hard to get other people in particular motivated, inspired to play this type of game that's so lengthy. But from a mechanical perspective, from a genius perspective, I definitely appreciate this game. My number 5 Z-Man game, Arle and Labora. Now we move on to my number 4 board game from Z-Man Games, and that is Prophecy, the classic fantasy-themed adventure game from Havre, originally designed in 2002. I forgot who the original publisher was, but eventually, sometime later, Prophecy was picked up by Z-Man Games. I'm not sure if it's still in print, but this game here is a fantasy adventure game, very much in the spirit, in the vein of the classic Talisman, but with a lot more control. It has been Euroized, if you will, by Havre, with lots of options as far as what you can do. First of all, there's no dice rolling for movement. There is dice rolling for combat. There is no dice rolling for movement. There's lots of other ways that players can control their movement. They have their basic movement, which is a free move, either one space to the clockwise direction or counterclockwise direction, or they can pay money. Money is a resource that they accrue throughout the course of the game. They can pay money to enhance their travel, go by horse and move a little bit faster, or go by ship and move from port to port, or even use a magic portal to go from one side of the board to the other. So there is a lot of control as far as that's concerned, but lots of the same tropes, the fantasy adventure tropes. You're going to different locations, fighting different monsters, encountering different NPCs. Ultimately, you're trying to make it to these different asteroids astral planes and be the first player to control a certain amount of artifacts. However, each of those artifacts is being protected by a guardian or multiple guardians, so you're going to have to get past those guardians first. And throughout the course of the game, you're taking actions that are going to help level up your character, add to their health stats, add to their magic stats, acquire different items by going to the village and going to the city and shopping for common and unique items in the forms of weapons, in the form of armor, in the form of scrolls and spells. You're going to your particular guild. Each character represents 2 different guilds, and you're going to your particular guild in order to acquire additional abilities and skills that will enhance your character. Lots of fun in this game. I really enjoy playing this game. Very charming. My number 4 game from Z-Man Games, Prophecy. Now we move on to my number 3 game from Z-Man Games, and that is El Grande, the classic grandfather of the area majority genre. And this here is the big box edition, which is what Z-Man is known for, which includes 5 expansions for El Grande. I have played 2 of the first expansions. I've played Grandissimo and the Grand Inquisitor and Colonies expansions, and I do find them to be fun and to enhance the game and even add additional territories such as Africa and the New World and even France. I like the idea, and also Portugal. I like the idea of having additional areas to contend for. Now, basically, the base game comes with this map of Spain, and it's divided into all of these regions, these different provinces. And players are trying to control and have the majority in these particular provinces, because after a particular amount of rounds, a scoring round will be triggered. And if you have the majority, you're going to score lots of points. However, if you have the secondary or tertiary, depending on the player count, you're also going to get a few points. So sometimes it's good to invest in these areas, even if you know you're not going to win. But there's so many cool things going on in this game, from auctioning for turn order to drafting these different action cards that either give you a lot of meeples that you can place down on the board, or they give you some really cool actions that can really be game-changing in particular circumstances. Really neat. I really appreciate this. I know this game has been out for a long time, but that's the thing about When Harry Met Board Games. We talk about classic board games here, and this is definitely a classic. My number 3 board game from Z-Man Publishers, and that's El Grande. Now we move on to my number 2 Z-Man game, and that is Fields of Arle, another Uwe Rosenberg big, heavy worker placement game. And this game here is actually unique to Uwe Rosenberg's repertoire in the sense that it's his only huge, grandiose worker placement game that's only for 2 players. He didn't have to make a smaller version to make a 2-player only. He went straight out the bat and made it 2-player only. Now, if you do buy the Tea and Trade expansion, that adds a 3rd player, so you can play a 3-player game. But with just the base game, it's 2 players. And this is a very typical rural, agricultural themed game as far as Uwe Rosenberg's concerned. But there are some elements that are unique to it. You're trying to acquire particular resources and go to cities that are demanding these resources. So there's an element of travel that takes place. And it's very abstracted, don't get me wrong, but thematically it's a new introduction that some of his other agricultural themed worker placement games don't have. You also have the similar things of your animals can produce food for you. Your animals can produce different resources for you. For example, your sheep can provide you with wool. And that wool is something that you can use in order to build, to create clothing, manufacture clothing, and travel to different parts of the world and deliver that clothing. Really neat. I like how the game plays. It's divided into 9 rounds. 5 of those rounds represent spring rounds or summer rounds, and 4 of those rounds represent winter rounds. And what's cool about this game is that the board is actually divided in half. You've got 2 halves to the board for the worker placement actions. So one side represents all of your summer actions that you can take, and the other side represents all of your winter actions that you can take. And each round, 1 player and 1 player only can take 1 action that's out of season. So for example, if it's the summer season, 1 player can take 1 winter action in that entire round with their 4 workers. However, that means that the other player will not be able to take an out-of-season action. So it's first come, first serve as far as that's concerned. So not only do you have different actions as far as the season, whether it's summer or winter, but you have different upkeeps because the summer is followed by the fall and the winter is followed by the spring. And the fall and the spring are like your upkeep rounds, which represent all the things that you have to pay. Perhaps you have to pay peat in order to keep your house warm or what have you. But it also represents what your animals generate. Are your animals going to generate food? Are your animals going to generate wool or some other materials? And that all depends on which season it's on. So that's something you are factoring in as far as your actions are concerned. I really like the asymmetry between the two different seasons and how that works out, and the mega massive year-long planning that you're really taking each round. Really cool. My number 2 board game from Z-Man Games, Fields of Arle. And now we move on to my number 1, my absolute favorite board game from Z-Man Games, and that is Marco Polo, designed by Daniel Tascini and Simone Luciani. And this game here is a worker placement game with dice as your workers. It has a Marco Polo theme, as the title indicates, where players are basically representing different merchants who are traveling the Silk Road, establishing markets in different towns along the way, and trying to generate and create as many resources as possible in order to sell them, in order to fulfill their contracts. In essence, this is a contract fulfillment game. And I'm a big fan of contract fulfillments. I like the fact that in this game, the contract fulfillment is really at the heart of it, because not only are the bulk of your points going to come from these different contracts, but also at the end of the game, the player who fulfilled the most contracts is actually going to be rewarded with an additional bonus. So that's something to keep in mind. You have all of these different dice here. Each player gets their dice in their color. You've got your meeples here to represent your merchants, to represent your markets, and also to represent the different resources that you can get, like spice and camels and gold. And you're doing all this, again, to try to accomplish the different contracts. You have the contracts here that tell you what's their demand, and it tells you how much victory points they get you. Sometimes they get you more than victory points. Sometimes they might get you an additional benefit. And you're trying to complete as many of these contracts as possible by turning these resources. Really cool. Getting to particular parts of the map along the Silk Road, you'll be incentivized by being the first player to establish a market in certain locations. The aesthetic of the game is really neat. I like how the worker placement works, where certain spots are blockable. You place your worker there or your dice, and nobody else can go there, typical of worker placement games. However, some locations are not blockable, but the only way a player can place their dice there after a previous player has is if they roll specific numbers that are higher than the numbers below them or the numbers used previously. So that's something to factor in when you're choosing how to utilize your dice. Really cool, again, thematically, mechanically. I even like the fact that each player has a unique character, some Marco Polo adjacent character from history that gives him or her a unique ability that distinguishes them from all the other players around the table. Really cool. My number 1 game from Z-Man Games, Marco Polo. And that's it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite board game from this publisher, Z-Man Games. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.